When modern medicine turned away from premature infants, one outsider refused to accept the verdict and built a life-saving system in the last place anyone expected. Hi, I'm Naba. Thanks for tuning into my channel. This channel documents decisions people made, often quietly, that reshaped outcomes far larger than themselves. Let's begin. At the turn of the 20th century, premature birth was not treated as a medical emergency. It was treated as an outcome. If a baby was born too early, weeks or months before term, the prevailing medical consensus was simple: that the child was unlikely to survive, and intervention was considered futile. Premature babies were often classified informally as non-viable. And this wasn't cruelty back then, it was framed as medical realism. At the time, hospitals were structured around adults and full-term births. There were no neonatal wards, no neonatal intensive care units, no standardized protocols for premature infants. And because the infrastructure didn't exist, the assumption followed that survival was impossible. Premature infants struggled to regulate body temperature. Their lungs were underdeveloped, infection risk was high, feeding was difficult. Mortality rates were severe. So medicine drew a conclusion that these babies were not meant to live. This conclusion eventually became eventuality. In most hospitals, premature infants were wrapped and placed aside. Families were told there was nothing to be done. Physicians believed intervention would only prolong suffering or undermine professional credibility. Incubators were not unknown in this period. In fact, early versions had been developed in Europe in the late 19th century, inspired by temperature-controlled enclosures used in animal husbandry. French obstetricians had experimented with heated chambers to stabilize premature infants. But these devices were not widely accepted. Many doctors considered them dangerous, experimental, or ethically questionable. Others argued that interfering with natural selection was misguided. The dominant belief held, if a baby could not survive on its own, it should not be forced to. And this was the environment into which Martin Couney entered. Martin Couney was born as Michael Cohen in the late 1860s in what is now Poland. Very little is known about his childhood, no detailed records. Couney emerged from obscurity without pedigree or institutional backing. What is known is that by the 1890s, he had moved to Paris. At the time, Paris was not just a city, it was the world's laboratory. Modern medicine was being argued, tested, and broken apart there. Not only in hospitals, but in lecture halls, experimental wards, and informal demonstrations. This was where all assumptions were challenged openly, where ideas were allowed to fail in public before being refined. It was in Paris that Couney encountered Dr. Stéphane Tarnier, an obstetrician working at the Maternite Hospital. Tarnier had made a radical observation. Premature babies were not dying because they were inherently weak. They were dying because they were cold. Their bodies could not regulate temperature. Exposure alone was killing them. To address this, Tarnier adapted incubators originally designed for poultry, enclosed chambers that maintained consistent warmth and controlled airflow. The idea was absurd, but it worked. Infants placed in these incubators stabilized. Breathing improved, weight increased, survival rates rose measurably. The evidence was no longer theoretical, it was visible. And yet, the medical establishment remained unconvinced. Incubators were expensive and required constant attention. And worst of all, they carried reputational risk. If a baby died inside an incubator, it would not be dismissed as fate. It would be blamed on intervention. Couney observed all of this closely. Where others saw an awkward device adapted from animal husbandry, he saw proof that effort was the missing variable. Proof that premature death was not inevitable but conditional. Couney later left Europe for the United States. America at the turn of the 20th century presented a harsher reality. Hospitals were conservative and hierarchical. Medical authority flowed from institutions, not experiments. European innovations were treated with suspicion, especially those that disrupted accepted definitions of viability. Couney attempted to enter the system directly. He approached hospitals, he spoke to physicians, he proposed incubator care for premature infants. The response was consistent and final. Hospitals did not want responsibility for infants expected to die. Doctors did not want association with methods deemed experimental. Administrators did not want legal or reputational exposure. What he began to understand was that this resistance had little to do with science. It was cultural. If premature infants could be saved reliably, then decades of medical judgment could be called into question. The verdict that these children were non-viable would collapse, and with it, the moral comfort of having done nothing. Couney did not try to force the system to change. He was pushed out of it. In a place unfamiliar to him at the time, Couney thought of every way possible to make this work. He came up with something rather bizarre, not just for its time, but even for now. At the time in America, exhibitions and fairs were where the public encountered new technology, electricity, machinery, industrial advances, all presented with academic mediation. These spaces were chaotic, commercial, and impossible to control. Couney understood the implication immediately. If medicine would not look, public would. If hospitals would not fund, spectators might. And if success happened in plain view, then it's living proof that it works. Couney actually began exhibiting premature infants in incubators. The incubators were products on display and meticulously maintained. Nurses were trained rigorously. Feeding, sanitation, and monitoring followed strict routines. It all fell into place. Families would pay nothing. The exhibits were funded by ticket sales. This decision triggered outrage. Physicians accused Couney of exploiting infants. Ethicists condemned the optics. Hospitals distanced themselves even further. Medicine did not belong to entertainment. Couney did not dispute the discomfort. He accepted it. Because while critics argued ethics, infants lived. Survival rates improved in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Couney documented everything. Outcomes were recorded, procedures refined, standards enforced. And these were not sideshows. In time, doctors who publicly dismissed Couney discreetly began sending Couney infants they could not treat. Babies born too early, too small. Couney accepted each and every one of them. By the end of this period, the incubator was no longer an idea. It was evidence. Medicine had not yet changed its mind, but it had been confronted. Martin Couney had made one thing unavoidable. Premature birth was no longer a verdict. It was a problem that could be solved if someone was willing to try. By the early 1900s, the question had already been answered. They worked. Now the problem was permission. Medical boards still would not endorse them, so hospitals would not fund them. Universities would not teach about them. Martin Couney understood something crucial at this point. Medicine did not reject incubators on scientific grounds. It rejected them on institutional ones. So he stopped asking. Instead of seeking approval, He looked for a place that operated on a different logic entirely. That place was Coney Island. At the turn of the 20th century, Coney Island was not frivolous. It was experimental. Electric lights, mechanical rides, moving crowds, human curiosity monetized at scale. This is at a much bigger scale than before. It was one of the few places in America where new technology could be shown directly to the public. Cooney saw an opportunity that others found grotesque. More visitors, more money. Every cent went towards care, staff salaries, sterilization, fuel, maintenance. As before, Cooney did not charge families. He never did. Critics still called it exploitation. Survival rates were posted openly, and the numbers were impossible to ignore. Where hospitals reported mortality rates as high as 80 to 90% for premature infants, Cooney's exhibit consistently showed survival rates above 75%. Thousands of infants passed through his incubators over the course of 4 decades. Thousands lived. Doctors often visited, some impressed, some furious. Cooney welcomed them all. But after a point, the irony sharpened with time. Hospitals began sending infants directly to Coney Island. When a baby was deemed too small, too fragile, too risky, families were quietly told where to go. Cooney never advertised this. He simply accepted the children. By the early 20th century, his incubator exhibit had become one of the most successful neonatal units in the world. For decades, Martin Cooney operated in a space medicine did not acknowledge. He was not licensed. But slowly, hospitals began to change. New neonatal wards were proposed, incubators were purchased, training programs were introduced. Because by now, the data was impossible to ignore. By the 1930s, incubators were no longer curiosities. They were becoming standard equipment. By the 1940s, neonatal care units began appearing inside hospitals. By the 1950s, premature infants were no longer automatically dismissed. The verdict had shifted. What had once been considered futile was now considered treatable. Medicine did not really credit Cooney at all. It simply adopted the practice and moved on. Cooney closed his exhibit in 1943, not in protest or defeat, because it was no longer needed. Hospitals were finally doing what he had been doing alone for 40 years. He stepped aside. By the time neonatal care became standard, few people remembered the man who built it in public. But tens of thousands of people were alive because he had. For most of his life, Martin Cooney worked very privately. The babies he saved were too small to remember him. Their parents were too overwhelmed to understand what he had built. The hospitals never acknowledged him. Lives were saved, but gratitude had no face to it. Until one day it did. By the 1930s and 1940s, something unexpected began to happen. Children who had once been labeled non-viable were now adults, healthy, working, living a normal life. There are accounts of adults standing in front of him, introducing themselves by the number of weeks early they had been born, by the life they were not supposed to have. Men and women stood in front of the man who had refused the verdict. For Cooney, they were never miracles. They were living proof. One woman reportedly told him that when she was born at just over 2 pounds, no hospital would take her. But he did. And now she had children of her own. So there's a term that's relevant to this story: moral outsourcing. Is an act of transferring ethical responsibility so that no single person has to own the human consequences of a decision. In the story of Martin Cooney, doctors knew premature babies were dying. Some even knew they could be saved. But Intervention carried reputational risk, institutional risk, professional risk. So the moral burden was handed off to medical norms, accepted practice, and the lack of precedent. The system became the decision maker. Individuals became functionaries. No one chose death, but no one chose life either. That is moral outsourcing. It is the space where we need more data replaces we have enough. The protocol doesn't allow it, replaces it is necessary. The board has not approved, replaces this is wrong. The responsibility dissolves into procedure, and because it is shared, it is felt by no one. This is why moral outsourcing is so seductive. It feels professional, it feels rational, it feels clean. It removes emotional burden from the decision maker while preserving the appearance of ethical neutrality. But neutrality in human systems is rarely neutral. It has a direction. It almost always favors delay, and delay always has a cost. In Couney's time, the cost was measured in infants. He refused to outsource his ethics as if the moral question had already been answered, because for him, it had. His quiet defiance was not against medicine, it was against the outsourcing of responsibility to a system that moved slower than life. This is why the concept is not historical, it is contemporary. Moral outsourcing is visible today in healthcare rationing, refugee processing, climate policy, algorithmic governance, corporate decision-making, and AI ethics. And sometimes care is the most dangerous posture of all, because lives do not wait for permission. Thanks for watching.